I'm Marcia Pally, New York University and also Humboldt University in Berlin. Welcome to the panel on populism and neo-nationalism outside the United States. People are still milling about, but we have a lot of effervescence of material and wonderful contributors. So I'm going to plunge right in and start by introducing, one second, is there a problem, Michael? I'm going to start by introducing the panelists. I will give a short 4-minute sort of conceptual introduction to the topic of populism and neo-nationalism and frameworks through which we should be thinking about it. And then each of our panelists will present for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a question and answer after each panelist for the individual presentation. And here we go. So, as I said, I'm Marcia Pally. I'm at New York University, and I teach one semester a year at Humboldt University in the theology faculty. I work on religion, culture, and politics, in particular on the relationality in religion as it intersects with the public sphere. To my immediate left is Thorsten Mayreis, professor of systematic theology at Humboldt University, Berlin, with a focus on ethics, hermeneutics, and he is co-founder and director of the Berlin Institute for Public Theology. His research interests include political ethics, ethics and sustainability, and economics and ethics. His most recent publication is Religion and Democracy, Studies in Public Theology, which he co-edited with Professor Rolf Schieder. From 2010 to 2016, he held the chair for systematic theology and ethics at the theology faculty at the University of Bern. After Professor Mayreis, we will hear from Professor Luke Bretherton, who could not be here owing to a family matter. But we do have Luke Bretherton's paper, which I will read. Luke Bretherton is Professor of Theological Ethics and Senior Fellow of the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. Before joining Duke, he was Reader in Theology and Politics and convener of Faith and Public Policy Forum at King's College, London. He has worked with a variety of faith-based NGOs, mission agencies, and churches around the world, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. His book, Hospitality as Holiness, explores the theological responses to moral pluralism. His work on faith-based organization and the church involvement in social welfare provision was drawn together in his book, Christianity and Contemporary Politics, which is the winner of the 2013 Michael Ramsey Prize for Theological Writing. To the left is Professor Dion Forster, Professor of Ethics and Public Theology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is the author of numerous books and articles on theology and ethics, the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the neuroscience of identity, the neuroscience of belief, and African Christian theology. He serves as chair of the Department of Systematic Theology and Ecclesiology in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Stellenbosch. He is also the director of the Bios Naude Center for Public Theology and is an international editor for the journal The Epworth Review. Professor Forster holds a PhD in theology and science and a second PhD, that's too many PhDs, Dion, in intercultural empirical biblical hermeneutics. And to his left, we have Professor Michael Minkenberg, Professor of Comparative Politics at the European University of Viadrina. From 2007 to 2010, he held the Max Weber Chair for German and European Studies at NYU. He has taught at the universities of Göttingen, Heidelberg, Cornell, and Columbia University. His research interests include the radical right in liberal democracies, the relationship between religion and politics in Western societies, and politics and architecture in Capital City. He has recently published the book, The Radical Right In Eastern Europe, democracy under siege, question mark. With those introductions, I'm going to plunge in to a quick introductory rubric for identifying a group, movement, or party as populist and neo-nationalist. This is a good place to start because those words are thrown around and used with, in many different parameters and with many different meanings in different disciplines and fields. And many people using this term do not mean exactly what other people mean when they use the term. I've been working with Trost and Mares on developing such a rubric for identifying populist and neo-nationalist groups. It's a slim rubric. Why a slim rubric? Because after a short list of common features that allow us to justify identifying a movement or group as populist, then we have to look into the surrounding culture's specific history, narratives, symbologies, and present conditions to understand the very important question, why is a populist movement persuasive? So we have a few general rubrics, ideas, but then we have to look at each specific milieu to find out why that populist movement is persuasive in situ. Why do we need such a rubric? Well, we also want to avoid the assessment that we call it democracy if we like the position, Bernie Sanders, and we call it populism if we don't like it. Yeah, that's not a theory of populism which needs to account for the spectrum of populist or neo-nationalist movements. Theories of populism need account for 1, populism on the left, 2, stronger and weaker types of populism, and 3, aspects of populist or neo-nationalism that are in fact productive responses to unresponsive governments and economies that actually contribute to the vibrancy of democratic discourse. My litmus test for any theory of populism and neo-nationalism is Bernie Sanders and William Jennings Bryan, who spoke neither of an exclusionary homogeneous people nor of moral purity, 2 characteristics that are often attributed to right-wing populism and that unhelpfully slides into a definition of all populism. To begin with our rubric, first, people have an interest in solving their problems. This is not a fatalistic point of view, but an optimistic point of view and worldview in believing problems can be solved by achievable change. That's step 1. Step 2, the problems most often of interest are economic and way of life duress. Economic duress or way of life duress. Economic duress, and this is very important, does not necessarily entail poverty or present unemployment or present underemployment. It could include also the sense that opportunity is unfairly distributed, even if you are currently employed, that familiar paths for self-betterment are disappearing. Way of life duress refers to a sense of threat to the way things should go down, to knowing what's fair, what's due you, and what's due to others. Both economic and way of life duress may be present, actual and active, or it may be anticipated. Fear of hardship, economic or way of life hardship for me or for my children. To address economic and way of life duress, people have an interest in who is under unfair duress, what Andre Gingrich calls the emotionalized us. Why and how we have been wronged by this unfair duress. By whom? Them. You'll notice that these questions are binary in form. This does not mean we. The we of this rubric that's on the screen now, the we is not just we of one supportive community, my church, my school group, my parent-teacher association, my sports club. Not at all. It's a we of my group, we in struggle. So there's the presence of struggle against others, so there's the against, who are unfairly doing us harm. That's the structure or shape of the we. In response to these interests, populism presents solutions. That's why they're attractive. It aims at addressing economic and way of life duress by providing who is we in struggle against an unfair them. Within these solutions, the degree of binarity, the binarity of the we and the them, suggests strong and weak forms of populism along a continuum. So one of the points we're adding here is that populism is not an on-off switch or a black-white situation. It's a continuum, and groups, movements, and parties fall along a continuum depending on strong and weak binarity. Degree of binarity depends on, well, how inclusive is that we of a variety of social, societal groups? The degree and permanence of the us-them struggle. Can a group fall in the middle? Could groups who are opponents on one issue be conceptualized as allies on another? Is there tolerance for ambiguity and gray areas? Or is it a very strong we, them binary? What is the possibility for understanding them as worthy opposition? Part of the legitimate vox populi with whom one's own group negotiates. In a hard binary, there is very little possibility of understanding them as part of the vox populi, to be talked to be negotiated with, to work things out with. Greater binarity suggests less inclusion of them in resource and opportunity distribution and in political and civil society processes and negotiations. The harder the binary, the more the them is out. Religion can be part of the us-them configuration, and when it is, we see two phenomena: the nationalization of religion and the sacralization of the nation. The nationalization of religion is where religious institutions and believers adopt populist values into their religious worldviews and even rituals. An example would be the adoption of a hawkish foreign policy by the American religious right. The sacralization of the nation is the phenomenon where the aura of sacredness is granted to the state, and certain functions of religious institutions are taken up by the state. In order to feel right, and this is the last point, and be thought effective, but feel right is very important. In order to feel right and be persuasive, populist solutions must be understandable. While new proposals are not precluded from understandability, the most easily grasped are familiar to the audience. Formations of us and them and solution to societal ills are drawn from the surrounding society's historical, cultural material. They are familiar. They are tapping into long-held structures in the society. These offer the pool of ideas about society, who's in and who's out, and about government, its composition and responsibilities, from which populism and neo-nationalism draw. Once a picture of society and government emerges, who's in and out, what's the role of government, who's legitimate government, this picture can be furthered by persons or groups with the resources and motives to do so. In sum, the first 6 points just reviewed help identify a movement as populist or neo-nationalist. Understanding why and how a movement is convincing takes us into the surrounding culture's historical cultural ideas about the nature and society of government. And now we will go to some of that historical cultural material and looking at case studies. Professor Thorsten Mayres.
Yeah, well, but the presentation is not. The basic idea was, wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
So, thank you for putting this panel together and for that introduction. Well, phenomena that allow for a label like right-wing populist scare in Europe aren't hard to find. When 2 months ago in the eastern German town of Chemnitz, a 35-year-old German of Cuban descent was knifed to death during a brawl, and the police looked for suspects of Iraqi and Syrian origin. Public demonstrations against foreigners and Muslim refugees resulted. The placard reads, "Foreigners out." From the midst of those demonstrations, xenophobic physical attacks on bystanders with non-Caucasian looks or apparel were launched while the police stood by. And journalists commented that middle-class citizens mingle with neo-Nazi supporters. For good measure, a Jewish restaurant was also attacked and vandalized. And of course, such attitudes aren't limited to non-Christians. Thus, Protestant churches in Germany are divided on the question of ministry or parish council membership of right-wing party AfD or Pegida followers. A faction called Christians in the AfD, a right-wing populist party, has just published a confessional document claiming to represent true Christianity. Populism in Western Europe most often presents itself as the voice of common sense, anti-elitism and anti-intellectualism, with an anti-institutionalist and anti-political stance in favor of the people's moral stance. This presentation suggests that populist movements in Western Europe more often than not also take a neo-nationalist stance, characterized by references to romantic and essentialist notions of people and nation, especially in the German-speaking world. Religion then is one of the factors playing the part of the signature of difference, distinguishing the supposedly innate cultural heritage of the people, conceived in essentialist terms, from alien influence. This analysis, my analysis, is connected to three claims. While populism is usually treated as a pejorative attribute in popular European debate, I hold populism to be at least ambivalent and would argue for a more precise view. Secondly, the phenomenon which has, to my mind, considerably more impact in Europe may be called neo-nationalism. In the German-speaking world, it is a type of ideology connecting to classical nationalism and its concepts of the people or nation as culturally, religiously, and ethnically homogeneous, and applying those to already well-established nation-states. Reasons for this development may be found in socio-economic and cultural distress following certain policies in regard to globalization. Religion in such movements takes the role of a distinction marker. For that reason, politico-religious claims need to be scrutinized. In the case of Germany, the religion in question, the majority religion, is Protestant and Roman Catholic Christianity. In the tradition I'm most familiar with, Protestant Christianity, there are historical, dogmatical tenets neo-nationalists can relate to, but also resources to oppose neo-nationalist claims. Both need to be articulated and critically discussed. A very short definition of concepts may be in order to clarify what we're talking about. I hold populism to be a theory with rather fuzzy edges, meaning there is no very distinct idea what populism is. I usually hold to the theory of Cas Moody and Rowan Cristobal Kaltwasser, who have described populism as a thin-centered ideology, that is to say, an ideology that needs to complement with other ideologies. It cannot stand for itself. a style of political communication using moral arguments or even moralism, and distinguishing usually between the pure people and the corrupt elites, preferring policies that are aiming at a volonté générale, that is to say, an idea that we have a well-known will of the people that should be enacted. However, political scientist Chantal Mouffe has argued that populism isn't just a bad guy. She's argued that it's at least ambivalent because, as she claims, it's a necessary element of democracy. Why? Because clear distinctions, raising passions, are necessary to avoid political apathy. And for the argument, it can be said that as populist parties came up in Europe and also in the United States, voter turnout had an upsurge, whereas before, political apathy was much more usual. Also, empirical analysis has shown that populist attitudes can and may very well correspond with pluralist ones, inclusively, as Akkerman and Mudde and others have shown in the Netherlands, where inclusiveness was not necessarily thrown out of populist attitudes, especially on the left side. And of course, talking about populism means a different thing if we do it in the United States, with its history of the populist movement in the 19th century, which was democratic, or if we talk about it in Europe, where this nativist idea of the people is very strong. Neo-nationalism I discern from nationalism. Nationalism I would call, with Anderson and Matasevich, the attachment to a nation, which of course is an imagined community, connected to the endeavor to form a nation state where it has not before existed in reaction to cultural oppression or even political oppression. On the other hand, neo-nationalism is a different movement as it takes place in states with already well-defined borders, where the nation state is already totally established. And it is characterized by the retractation of regulations and governance from an international to a national level, as can be exemplified in the European Union, where many regulations were already internationalized, and the Brexiteers are the paradigm of that, because they say, no, we want to rule that to govern that in our own country. We don't want regulation on an international scale. Often it is a reaction to economic and cultural insecurity, and it happens on the right as well as on the left. Now, if we look at the German case to see how populism is a reaction to insecurity, I will come to religion in a moment. We have to look at three developments which act as a hermeneutical lens through which globalization and its consequences were made visible in Germany. It is the welfare reform of 2002 and 2003, the financial crisis of 2007 and beyond, and the refugee policy of 2015. The welfare reform of 2003, although successful in terms of reducing unemployment rates, it was a very successful reform, actually, and bringing many people into work, replaced the hitherto generous unemployment benefits directed at the preservation of a given standard of living with a policy of poverty relief and workfare. For many middle-class employees, this amounted to a terrible injury because they felt after a lifetime of labor, if the economical development led to being unemployed, after 1 year they were on poverty relief. And this, as the welfare reform was accompanied by a popular depiction of welfare recipients as lazy, dirty, and drunk, cultural injury was sustained. Ultimately, politically, it led to the deterioration of the Social Democratic Party who had initiated those reforms. Why? First of all, a strong faction of the Social Democratic parties split off and joined the remnants of the former Socialist Party in the east of Germany, where there were other cultural injuries that were nurtured and sustained. And secondly, Social Democratic Party lost trust. And so in 2005, in the 2005 elections, the Social Democrats were swept away and Angela Merkel's conservatives came into power. The faction of the SPD that broke away and the Eastern German Party joined forces and became the party Die Linke, the left, which is a populist party by all accounts. And I've shown you a placard saying welfare reform means decreed poverty. So this is the first injury that led to populism. The second one was the 2007 financial crisis. In German, the Euro Rescue Fund is called the Rescue Umbrella. And you can see on those cartoons how this bailout of banks and European states with high debts was felt by German voters. It says, now you go save the euro. That's Merkel, that's telling that to the figure with a little cap. That's the German symbol of the ordinary person, the German Michel, who symbolizes the ordinary taxpayer. He has to take that terribly big umbrella to bail out banks and other states. On the other cartoon you can see the idea, well, sorry, we're only there to save the banks. The people get lost in the rain. So that led to public disgruntlement. It also led in Europe to a narrative of the greedy North and the lazy South. You can see this in that cartoon, a Greek cartoon from 2012. Thanasi na krypsu ta zontana. Thanasis, hide the livestock, Merkel is coming to Greece. On the other hand, in Germany and in the northern states, we have the lazy South narrative, and you see Greeks feasting and a German tourist on the side, and the Greek guy is saying, the bill, oh, the fat guy over there will take care of it. Oh, it's the lazy South feasting on expense of the industrious northern states. That led to a break in loyalty to the European Union and also to the rise of populist parties. On the political right, Angela Merkel's policy of holding on to the euro led to strong disgruntlement, especially among conservative economists, who then funded a party that was busy with trying to get rid of the euro due to what they saw as a problematic entanglement with economically weak countries. But that wasn't all. When Angela Merkel temporarily opened the borders for refugees from the Syrian civil war in 2015, the AfD, this party, changed again. It turned to a populist anti-immigration stance, and the conservative economists were pushed out of the party in favor of a xenophobic policy. Why? Well, while being politically conservative, Angela Merkel had culturally liberalized the conservatives with issues as the recognition of openly homosexual conservatives, same-sex marriage, or gender questions. And they produced uneasiness with many conservative voters who then turned to the party called AfD. Merkel's political move of opening the border was all the more unexpected as her political party, the CDU, had declared for decades that Germany was no immigration country and consequently vetoed attempts to institute regular immigration policy with due procedures. Subsequently, In this party, I've told you, the AfD, the economic conservatives were pushed aside by anti-immigrationist agents who strongly employed populist strategies, blaming the Merkel government as a corrupt elite bound to destroy the... Hello? Ah, good. Bound to destroy German identity. And you can see that on those placards. Do away with Germany, yes we can. The yes we can, wir schaffen das, yes we'll make it, was Merkel's slogan when the immigration was happening. And on the second picture you can see an illustration of people versus corrupt elite. Merkel with a headscarf, and it says on the placard, Mrs. Merkel, here's the people. And those parties now associated with movements like the Pegida Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident. On an ethno-cultural stance, tapping into German romanticist nationalist traditions, this movement tries to depict Europe as a Christian territory where Islam is an alien and consequently problematic phenomenon. While this claim is highly ideological, the failure to deal with immigration and its problems in open political debate beyond harmonistic fantasies of multiculturalism and cataclysmic fantasies of alien invasion has paved the way for a highly ideological right-wing neo-nationalist groups blaming the victims. Especially during the 2016 state elections, AfD results skyrocketed to as much as 24% of the vote. You can see here the numbers for different German states, and even in the west of Germany, the AfD got like 15% of the vote or even more. To give a European comparison, I'll look at the development in a few other states very quickly. In the Swiss case, there's also a populist party, the so-called Swiss People's Party, and they, in 2009, launched a campaign to ban minarets because they were arguing that the minaret, the Islam, would destroy Swiss national identity and would invade. There are in numbers, 4 minarets in Switzerland, and when they launched this campaign, and you can see on the poster, it says, "Stop yes to the ban on minarets," and the minarets look like rockets, actually. And even though all the churches, the mainline churches, and all the other religious groups too, were against this campaign and said so openly, the SVP, the Populist Party, argued with the hereditary Christianism of Switzerland and got most of the votes. And this, even though Switzerland is a very secularized country, much more secularized than Germany. So the religious communities didn't get the vote, but the claim that a religion that the Populist Party represented a true Christian heritage made the grade, and now this ban on minarets is a part of the Swiss constitution. In the Netherlands, the situation is even different. Geert Wilders, that you can see on this picture, leads the Partij voor de Vrijheid, the party for freedom. They got with 20 seats. They are the second strongest political force in the Netherlands, and they argue manifestly anti-Islamic, but on a different stance. They argue that Islam is threatening all the liberal values we Dutch and Netherlands citizens stand for, and the logic is totally different because they're from Switzerland or Germany, because in the Netherlands, the answer to religious strife in the 17th and 18th century was the pillarization of society. Every religious group had its own schools, its own welfare systems, and so on, and so everybody got along. In the 60s, there was a secularization, and the pillarization system failed, and from then on, worldview and religion were seen as individual decisions. And no social formative power of religion was acknowledged anymore. When Islamic people came in, this type of domestication of religion, pillarization or individualization, didn't seem to them very attractive. And that was the reason, and that was the point in which Geert Wilders could connect and say, well, true Dutchness means liberality. Geert Wilders is gay himself, and so we need to be xenophobic and kick Muslims out. Last example would be France, another different phenomenon. There are two roots of French national identity. There's a religious root because France calls itself the first daughter of the church since the baptism of King Clovis. Religion serves as a cultural marker of national identity. On the other hand, there's a secular root as politically laïcité, the strict separation of church and state, is a very characteristic element since the French Revolution. Now, le Front National, the populist party of Marine Le Pen, draws on both roots and says, well, they're not Catholic, and there are the Muslims, they don't adhere to laïcité, so kick them out. And that's the point there. And she also got in the last electoral round the second strongest voting turnout, 21.3% as opposed to 24% for Macron. Yeah, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to skip the other ones. In Germany, the role of religion is even more ambivalent. While the church leaders and elites on the Roman Catholic, but also on the Protestant side, are strongly internationalist and take a pro-refugee stance. The AfD and the Pegida movement, concerned Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident, they try to use Christian symbols, and they feel that Christian symbols are correct to a strategy of a nationalization of religion. They try to use those symbols to say, well, to be German means to be Christian. On the grassroots level, people are divided, although the AfD gets as many as 15 or 24% of the vote. In Christian communities and parishes, we're the strongest agents in refugee relief on a voluntary level. So there is conflict. And I will skip the historical part now due to time. So to sum up, populism remains an ambivalent notion, but not the most problematic. Neo-nationalism is more problematic, and I understand it as a reaction to cultural and economic problems that need to be addressed, tapping into historical and cultural and religious resources. And the challenge of identity formation through a nationalization of religion needs to be met. And there are two possible ways to do that, and both need to be gone. First, a strategy of public theology, publicly articulating and communicating the strife. We had this morning a panel about Christian resources against nationalism and against colonization, and there was nobody present who was on the other side. And this cannot continue. We need to have communication between the sides. A second strategy that is necessary means to enable people to develop ambiguity, tolerance, and empathy for different perspectives. Thank you very much.
In light of the time, you can stay there. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll have to move on to the next paper, so we make sure everybody gets their presentation. 1 or 2 questions for Thorsten Mayreis?
There's a microphone up there.
No, it's just a quick question regarding your definition of what you say, populism. Coming from a German context, I'm surprised you don't mention Jan Werner Müller and his, for me, I mean, I don't want to account for it here, you know it much better than me, but he has a very useful, what do you say, definition of populism.
Well, this is a this is a very specialized question. I would say that my problem with Jan Werner Müller is twofold. First of all, he uses populism as a epitheton for the supply side. He's talking about politicians. He's not talking about voters. And I'm interested in populism as a reaction that that for people is attractive. I want to know about voters, not only about politicians. This is the first point. And the second point is he doesn't really look at reasons. It's just a wrong ideology, period. And I think that's too easy and too simple.
Thank you.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm the bad mommy who has to keep track of the time.
I will be there afterwards. So
okay, and at the end we can have more. I just want to do justice to everybody who came to the panel. So as you can see, some of the themes of this panel are already coming through. That we had in our introduction, that you have combinations and different configurations of both economic and way of life directs, the necessity of country-specific investigations. As Thorsten Mayreis showed, the Netherlands is very different from France, which is very different from Germany, and so on. And we've also seen that populism in some cases is a positive response to a democratic discourse. So these things will continue to come out in the paper by Luke Brotherton that I will read, as he had to leave for a family matter. The I is Luke Brotherton in this text. The paper I put forward has 2 interrelated theses. The first is that contemporary forms of populism need situating within a social and intellectual history that emerges out of theological and ecclesial forms of populism. The second is that populism is ideologically underdetermined and can either be democratic or anti-democratic. To illustrate, I will focus on the British Isles. So we've seen those themes before. Here they come with the UK. Thesis 1. As a political phenomenon, modern populism emerges out of forms of theological and ecclesial populism, and itself is complexly religious and non-religious. Populism in the UK is often seen as a recent phenomenon identified with UKIP or Brexit. But a broader perspective reveals a different picture. In contradistinction from UKIP, the Blue Labour platform is an attempt to construct a distinctly English democratic populism. It self-consciously builds on the British populism of the British New Left of the 1950s, as articulated by such features as E.P. Thompson. And when its ecclesial genealogy is taken into account, populism can be seen as a perennial feature of British political and ecclesial landscape, even from the early modern period, including the diggers, levelers, Chartist movements, Luddites, etc. So the nature and extent of populism in Britain can only be understood if it is situated in the longer theological genealogy of the country. More broadly, my claim is that populism is a perennial feature not only of England but of Christianity, born out of a sense that the renewal of relationship to God and the righteousness of the church comes through direct, non-institutionally mediated access to God. Arguments for direct access pose the reading of Scripture or the work of the Spirit in opposition to encounter with God mediated by elite representatives. This theological and ecclesial populism generates opposition to clerical and political elites who are seen to usurp God and rule either in their own interests or in the service of idols. It was this kind of populism that formed the background to debates in the post-Reformation era in England and a precursor of modern British democracy. The interconnection between ecclesial and political populism can be seen in the conception of the people that each shares. Central to modern conceptions of democracy and to modern conceptions of the church is the term the people. Just as the church only exists if there is an ongoing process of forming the people of God, there is also no democracy unless there is a formation of the demos. The telos of the people of God and the demos may differ, but there is a direct analogy between them, and their modern conceptualization shares an intellectual and social history. Inherent in the ecclesial and political uses of the people is the sense that to be a people is in some way to be a moral community, that is an end in itself. For a people to be dominated by a foreign power, corrupted by tyranny, or fractured through internal strife is to lose a substantive good. The meanings of what it means to be a people is unstable and ambiguous. In classic usage, the people signifies various and sometimes contradictory things. The entire entity of a polity, 1. 2, a common or non-elite members, the assembly of people made up of those eligible to participate in legal and political matters, or the source of sovereignty. This ambiguity that arises out of the different meanings of people carries over into our uses of the term. Democratic conceptions of peoplehood share a genealogy with ecclesial conceptions of peoplehood being the people of God. With the recovery of Roman law from the 12th century onwards, there was a renewed emphasis on the role of the people as legitimizing the basis for sovereign power. With the Reformation, this Roman legal framework was combined with the hallowing of the ordinary life as a site of divine disclosure, and the hallowing of popular political agency. What emerges from the early medieval period to the Reformation is a shift from a doctrine of royal accountability to an emphasis on the people as sovereign and rule by the people. The failure of a ruler to keep her promises frees the people on this rule from the obligation to obey and justifies resistance to unjust rule. This very resistance became the Protestant resistance radicalized during the English Civil War of 1642 to 1651. The theological and political emphasis on the centrality of the people generates two forms, a reformist form and a radical wing. In both, the Republican form of the policy is the ideal, but in the reformist, the people are conflated with the nation and the republic with the nation state. This constituted by Israel is the template for this conflation of the people with the state, in that case with the covenantal people. This theological debate is the background to the emergence of the Westphalian order and conflating the rule of the religion of the prince with the nation state. My contention is that the contemporary forms of British populism combine elements of both the radical concept of the people and the reformist strand. Echoing its theological genealogy, the modern view of the people has a messianic quality. The people can rise up to reinvigorate or redeem the body politic that is subject to corruption and disillusion, echoing the idea of the introduction of populism as a solution to social ills. This redemption, so you hear the echo to certain terms we used in the rubric in the introduction. This redemption can be either backward or forward-looking. In retrospective forms, redemption involves recovering what was lost. For example, the Brexit 2016 was successful in leveraging the retrospective, looking back vision. In its forward-looking form, the people rise up to break with a tyrannous or dominating power and to found a new polity of enlightened self-rule by the people. This forward-looking form was the foundation mythos of the American and French revolutions, for example. Second thesis, populism is ideologically undetermined and can be either democratic, productive for democracy, or anti-democratic, depending on how the nature and the basis of the people is imagined or narrative. So this is what we heard earlier. Who is we, who is them? How is that conceptualized and how sharp the binary? Part of the difficulty in understanding populism is its protean nature. Populism is a sponge that soaks up the ideological spills around it. This feature sits alongside other features in the society. For example, opposing instinct and emotion as a rational or legalistic spirit, a simplified antagonistic vision of society, and so on. But all of these, populism amidst all else in society, can serve both utopian and conservative ideological goals of either the left or the right. For example, a figure like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, in British, used populist discourse, but his ideology was left, socialism. Conversely, Nigel Farage, former head of UKIP, also used populist discourse, but for a libertarian and right-wing position. When people refers to a community of blood or race or homogeneous group of a shared culture, populism then can align with racist and xenophobic ideologies. Similarly, populism can also incorporate religious beliefs. For example, Blue Labour explicitly draws on Catholic social teaching and what it calls the politics of the common good. In short, populism merges with other ideologies and discursive frameworks of the surrounding culture as a broader vision of restoring, creating solutions, restoring democracy and government to the people. There have been various attempts to develop a comprehensive theory of populism. Much of this work takes a wholly negative view of populism. This negative view is prevalent in Europe and North America, where journalistic and academic work on populism is focused on the emergence of right-wing, anti-immigrant movements. But the scope of such work is parochial and historically myopic, because it disregards the ideologically undetermined nature of populism, and in doing so, such analyses ignore the populist nature of the third wave of democratic revolutions that ended communism in Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. Within many critical readings, populism becomes a term of abuse, whereby the common folk are labeled as uneducated, vulgar, and simplistic, in contrast to cultivated, educated elites. The former should not be allowed to rule, whereas the latter, the elites who are educated, are the rightful rulers. The empirical basis of populist parties and movements rarely backs up these designations. But there is a latent anti-democratic suspicion among critics of populism, especially those who don't recognize populist movements that actually invigorate the democratic discourse. Critics wonder, will populism coarsen political life and generate chaotic and ruinous policies? This again refers to the need to understand what the ills people experience, and again, why they choose the solutions, that word keep coming up, populism as solution to these ills, the ills that people experience. The ideological indeterminacy of populism makes categorizing it along left and right spectrum a conceptual mistake. It's not either left or right. Dividing populism between democratic and authoritarian forms is more helpful in distinguishing between kinds of populism. Following the pioneering work of political theorists Margaret Canavan and Ernesto Laclau, populism should not be seen as something inherently dangerous, but is playing off of tensions within democracy itself. For Canavan, populism is a contextual phenomenon that reacts to whatever is hegemonic. And in the context of modern liberal democracies, populism is an inherent possibility born out of the oscillation between what Canavan identifies as redemptive and pragmatic face of democracy. When democracy, which offers government of and by and for the people, is reduced to mechanisms for negotiating and resolving conflicts of interests and distributing power, that's its pragmatic face. Populists then move into the territory and looking for renewal, its redemptive face. And that can come in the form of Donald Trump promising to drain the swamp. Building on Canavan, a constructive way to distinguish between different kinds of populism is to distinguish between a populist democratic politics and a populist anti-political forms. Democratic populism attempts to construct a common life, not by denying friend-enemy distinctions, but via a heightened process of conflict and conciliation, generating a richer sense of what is the good of the whole body politic. This conception is what I refer to in the introduction as the notion of your opponent as a worthy opponent with whom you work through to solutions. A populist democratic politics embodies a conception of politics that works to reinstate plurality and inhibit totalizing monopolies, whether the state or market monopolies, through common action and deliberation, both of which depend on personal participation and responsibility for the common life. By contrast, anti-political populism refuses the possibility of a common life, narrowing what is considered common via exclusionary and dichotomized visions of who is in and who is out, who is we and who is them, who is part of the people and who is not. The hard binarity that we've already heard. In anti-political populism, throwing off established authority structures is the prelude to giving over authority to one and giving up responsibility for the commons. The goal of anti-political populism is withdrawal from public life. In anti-political expressions of populism, personal responsibility is for the improvement of the self, one's immediate family or institution or political party, rather than the care of public institutions, rule of law, physical infrastructure, natural resources that make up the Commonwealth. Stuart Hall argues that Thatcherism represented authoritarian populism. In the contemporary context, UKIP represents this latter kind of anti-political populism. For example, UKIP's claim to speak for the British people moves beyond a contingent political and economic claim. They do not argue for the incorporation of other interests other than their own, and visions other than their own, in the discussion about the good of the whole. They make an identity claim that who they are fully and completely embodies and defines what it means to be British. Claims to represent that the people go wrong when they move beyond the claims, these specific claims. They represent an in toto we the people. Interpretations of populism reflect the contradictory responses to the people. The people are vicious and virtuous, irrational and bearer of the nation true spirit, a thread of democracy and holders of sovereignty. Critics of populism see it as an aberration that unless it is prevented, it will poison the democratic body politic. But again, such a view, I contend, is that populism is an inherent and often benign feature of democratic politics. Yet, as with all forms of politics, it can become toxic. When manifested in forms of populist democratic politics, populism seeks to generate a common life as against a politics dominated by the interests of the one or the few, or even dominated by the interests of the many, some imagined homogeneous mass. However, in its anti-political forms, populism distorts democracy by claiming to wholly identify the people with the interest of the part rather than what is the common good. Brexit, as a manifestation of populist sentiment, displays both constructive and negative aspects of populism. Constructively, it is a call for a return to democratic sovereignty against the administrative and procedural rule of the European Union, which on any account suffers a massive democratic deficit. Negatively, Brexit ties populist impulses to a pre-political, folkish vision of the British people as an ethnically, homogeneously constituted nation. Whether in Britain or anywhere else, it behooves us scholars to attend to the ambiguity of a phenomenon like populism, resisting reductive frameworks, and as scholars of religion, we should identify its complexly religious and non-religious bases. I hope my two theses suggest a way for achieving these goals. Thank you very much for listening to Luke Brotherson's paper. Okay. And now from South Africa, we have Professor Dion Forster.
Good afternoon. You're incredibly brave to still be awake at this stage, and I've decided not to use PowerPoint, so let's see how that goes. I'd like to discuss today state theology and political populism, a consideration of religious populism in South African politics. And the paper that I will read is based on three basic premises. First of all, that not all forms of religious political populism are negative. Secondly, that we must situate religious political populist movements within their social and historical contexts. And thirdly, that we need to find some way to do this that is both philosophically and theologically grounded if we are to take account of the philosophical and theological complexities of religious and political populism. So what this paper will do is present a critical theological conversation on religious populism and its role in contemporary South African politics. And in order to do so, we will look at the relationship that exists between the largest mainline Christian denomination in South Africa, the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, and the current governing party, the African National Congress. In order to critique the relationship between the Methodist Church and the ANC, the African National Congress, we will make use of the 1985 South African Kairos document in relation to particular terminology that was developed as state theology, prophetic theology, and church theology. So first of all, the question, is all political religious populism bad? In order to construct the argument in this section, I relied on the work of Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, and a Swedish theologian named Fredrik Porten. Now, as we know, Laclau suggests that populist movements emerge when citizens unite into a new social body called the people that opposes what they view as a political, economic, or social elite. And often these populist groupings arise out of a sense of frustration with the policies, views, and actions of this elite and how they disenfranchise, ignore, or deliberately oppress the concerns and needs of the people. Now, what Porten points out is that the kind of rhetoric that emerges in populist movements often leads to an extreme form of othering. And so, as we've already heard in the preceding papers and in the introductory remarks, populism is often dismissed because words such as the enemy are used by populist movements. Porton, however, suggests that the creation of the possibility of a social imagination, the ability to imagine a social order that is slightly different from that exists, is one of the positive possibilities of populism. And in particular, the philosopher Chantal Mouffe helps us to understand why this is so. She engages political populism from the perspective of a feminist critique. And she asks the question, rightly I think, who is it that decides what is right, what is normal, or what is desirable in a society? She enters into conversation with the work of Francis Fukuyama, and I know that he is somewhat controversial, but particularly his book, The End of History, in which he suggested with the emergence of liberal democracy that history had come to an end. Now, I must say, as an African in America and in Europe, I can often see what she is talking about. Liberal democracies are structured along the lines, more or less, of what is considered to be forms of common agreement. And there seems to be an attempt very often in the liberal democracy to try and do away with forms of conflict. So in other words, to structure society in such a way that there is a generally low level of conflict, public conflict, and so that people tend to try to agree on common sets of values. Now, this may be fine if you fit in the middle of the bell curve, but if you are a sexual minority in a conservative culture, if you're a woman in a patriarchal society, or if you come from an economic class or a race group that does not occupy the center, I think that there is an important reason to try and find voice for your concerns. So one of the outcomes of Western-styled liberal democracies is that they have weakened the conceptual notion of the political, no longer allowing enough space for divergent and even conflicting points of view. Now, if we were to take this line of reasoning seriously, we could conclude that some forms of populism, situated within their social and historical contexts, may indeed be desirable. And there should be some philosophical, political, and in this case, even theological criteria that can aid us in assessing whether a form of populism in its time was constructive or destructive. Now let's turn to the South African perspective. South Africa has a very interesting relationship when it comes to religious political populism. And perhaps the most widely considered relationship of this nature was the relationship that existed during the apartheid era between the South African nationalist government and the Dutch Reformed Church during that period. This nexus of power that was formed was a new form of elite. It was Calvinist, it was white, and it was Afrikaner. And it was clearly opposed to the common good of the people. And so what we saw emerging during that period were a number of church leaders and church groupings that we could characterize, in accordance with Leclos and Mouffe, as populist, religious populist movements. And some of the names that I mentioned may sound familiar to you. People like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. Beyers Nudia, who was a Dutch Reformed cleric until his dismissal from the church for critiquing apartheid theology. Bishop Peter Story from the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, the Reverend Dr. Alan Bussack, who was instrumental in pushing for sanctions against South Africa, and of course Dr. Frank Chikane. Now, something happened with these religious leaders that captured the spirit of the public imagination against the elite theological and political viewpoints of the Nationalist Party and of the church, the Dutch Reformed Church. And some remember the role of the churches, particularly these churches, such as the Methodist Church, Anglican Church, and Catholic Church, in very positive terms. In fact, Nelson Mandela in 1994, in an address, one of his first public addresses to the gathered conference of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, said the following: "When pronouncements and actions against the powers that be meant persecution and even death, you, as the Methodist Church, dared to stand up to the tyrants. The Methodist Church was the only church to be declared an illegal organization under apartheid. For 10 years, you were forbidden to operate in the Transkei. Now, however," now listen to this turn, he says, "like all other institutions of civil society, the church must help South Africans to rise to the challenge of freedom. The energy that was once dedicated to the breaking of apartheid must be harnessed to the task of building the nation." Now we can see how easily these notions turn. And so what some would have regarded as a very positive form of religious populism in the deconstruction of apartheid very quickly became negative. After 1994, when the shifts in power took place and it was no longer the Dutch Reformed Church and the National Party, but now the African National Congress and the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, a new form of elite emerged. And while the political and religious actors had changed, a concerning complicit relationship once again emerged between the churches and the state. However, the configuration of this relationship is interesting, since the Methodist Church of Southern Africa and the African National Congress seem to represent the majority of the people, certainly numerically. And what we found was a very concerning, and we see this even now, problematic forms of behavior between the church and the state. And I'll cite just one example of this. In the lead up to the most recent South African national elections in 2014, there was an increasing rhetoric of a religious nature that was intended by politicians to sweep up support for the African National Congress. Now, this is not surprising in a country where 84% of South Africans self-identify as Christian. What was even more problematic was that certain church groupings aligned themselves clearly with certain political parties. 65% of ANC parliamentarians in the last parliamentary census said that they were Methodists. Now, one of the most public displays of political religious populism were the activities of the Reverend Vukile Mahana, the chaplain general of the ANC at the time and a senior minister in the Methodist Church. President Jacob Zuma, at a public speech, said the following. He said, "I start and find my identity in Christian principles. Christianity is part of what I am. In a way, it is the foundation of my political beliefs." Then he went on to say, "When you vote for the ANC, you are also choosing to go to heaven. When you don't vote for the ANC, you should know that you are choosing for the man who carries a fork and who cooks people. And when you are carrying an ANC membership card, then you are blessed. And when you get up there, there are different cards being used, and if you have an ANC card, you will be let straight into heaven." Now, clearly, this form of political religious rhetoric fits in very clearly with the opening remarks that we heard about the sacralization of the state. Now, the Reverend Mahana had the following to say in defense of the president, slightly more nuanced, but equally religiously political populism. The Reverend Mahana said, and I quote, "While the popular Christian understanding of heaven is equated to a physical place, theologically, heaven can also mean the presence of God. When the president urged citizens to vote for the ANC, equating it with heaven, he meant theologically that voters may miss out on the opportunity of being in the presence of God if they do not vote for the ANC." Now, an analysis of this particular statement shows that the Reverend Mahana is clearly engaged in a form of religious populist rhetoric. He's trying to place the people and the ANC and those who vote for the ANC on the side of God. And I wonder how God may feel about that. Now, I'm going to conclude the paper in a moment, but just to say one of the reasons why this took place is because the African National Congress, which had carried a 2/3 majority in South Africa since the very first elections, was losing its political support due to increasing scandals of corruption, political infighting, and the emergence of a new black economic elite that seemed disconnected from the needs of the people. And in situations like this, identity politics, but also the politics of religion, allow the opportunity for creating a fictive other. And in this particular instance, the other that was being created was not only the white elite, which we know remains a problem in South Africa, but also a particular elite who were being disassociated from their religious beliefs. So how do we critique this kind of political religious nationalism? Well, one of the ways in which this is being done in South Africa currently is to revisit the Kairos document of 1985. And those who are familiar with South African theology and church history will know that the Kairos document was written during one of the most brutal periods of South African political abuse in the height of apartheid. And what the Kairos theologians noted was that very often the church provides the software that allows the hardware of the state to function without moral recourse, without any questioning. And we can see that once again, this is happening. The Methodist Church of Southern Africa, one of the largest denominations, or the largest denomination in the country, very closely allied to a political party which is losing the confidence and trust of its people, is once again employing a form of religious and populist rhetoric which the Kairos document would call state theology, a theology that subjugates its theological responsibility not to the will of God, which the Kairos document calls prophetic theology, but to the will of the state. Thank you.
So we have time for a few minutes of questions for Dion Forster, and we have microphones towards the front of the hall for people who want to come and ask questions. Do you want to stand by the microphone? Thank you.
Dion, thank you. I just
There you go.
wondered if you had any sense of where the critical voices now, the critical religious voices are in South Africa, which are speaking prophetically to the Methodist Church of Southern Africa in its troublingly close association with the ANC.
So this is a very interesting thing. There are actually critical voices within the church. The presiding bishop of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa is one of those voices. He's maintained a relationship of distance from the governing party. The South African Council of Churches has also spoken out very clearly about this. You might know that the World Council of Churches in its last meeting issued a working paper, a document, on the religionization of politics and the politicization of religion. And so the South African Council of Churches has adopted that and is working very, very closely. But it's an incredibly complicated relationship. Take, for example, the presiding bishop. In South Africa, bishops are elected by popular vote. And in the lead up to the re-election of the new bishop, this critical bishop, the African National Congress tried to get its members, ANC members, who are part of the Methodist Church, to vote the current bishop out of power so that a bishop who was more supportive of their political ideals could be elected. And so the current presiding bishop and the other bishops had to issue a statement to the church to say, that's not how we do these things. So it's an incredibly complex and contested thing. But there are movements and persons working to combat that.
We have time for one more. If there is one more question for Dion Forster. Okay, thank you. And now we have Michael Menkenberg. Do you need this? the technical doings are almost as traumatic as populism and neo-nationalism.
No, they're not.
No.
Let me clarify something while he's doing the technical stuff. In my title, I talk about Eastern Europe, and I don't want to have a discussion later on about what is it and why, or the deconstruction of Eastern Europe.
Just press this.
Okay. It's a shorthand term that I use for the entire region from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea that was under Soviet domination until 1989. So visitors from Poland and the Czech Republic, if they're here, you may forgive me for subsuming your countries in the category. I know that's not how Poles or Czechs see their own country, but otherwise I would have to always say the Central European, Baltic Sea European, Southeast European, Balkan European, and other Europeans in the East. That's just too long. I have only 20 minutes. So let's start. In post-1989 Eastern Europe, the process of regime change and democratization seemed having come to a conclusion with most post-communist countries' accession to the European Union in 2004-2007. Apparently, the transformation process in the region reached its climax. It meant established, stable democracies firmly rooted in a European community and sharing the same liberal and democratic values. But the quality of democracy has suffered some severe backlashes in the meantime. At the beginning of 2016, nationalist anti-establishment politics and the agenda of the radical right, what is nowadays called populism, have reached new levels of support in Europe in general and in particular in the new democracies of the post-communist East. And in my presentation, I'd like to take a closer look at the main actors of the European far right in a comparative fashion and how they have affected politics and the system. My major argument is twofold. First, due to the dual nature of the transition process from Soviet hegemony to national independence and from communist to democratic societies and the unfinished process of nation building in the region, the radical right in Eastern Europe is a phenomenon sui generis, which means it is ideologically more extreme and organizationally more fluid than its West European counterpart. And the second, the fluidity and limited electoral success of these parties do not render them less significant, quite to the contrary. The specific context in which they operate, along with the multitude of right-wing movements, permits a considerable degree of impact in their respective political systems. Now, a few conceptual clarifications. My concept of radical right is grounded in modernization theory and offers an operational definition centered on the ideological core of exclusivist, populist, ultranationalism. The criteria here are those of exclusion from the people as defined in ultranationalist terms, from racist to ethnocentrist to cultural and religious. These can all be figures of exclusion or drawing lines between us and them. And that leads to different ideological versions of the radical right, fascist or violence-prone versions of radical right extremism. There is ethnocentrism, and there is the category of religious ultranationalism. Now, you may wonder, where does populism fit in here? I have used populism in my research more as an adjective than a noun, meaning populism qualifies some other isms. We heard already about thick and thin ideology. I don't use it as an ideology like Jan Werner Müller and others. I use it more as a style or strategy of communication, still with the same logic of us versus them, the corrupt establishment and so on, but in terms of an attribute of politics, not in terms of an ideology comparable to liberalism or socialism. If I take these criteria of exclusion, then I arrive at typology of radical right groups, ideological versions. You see here these three major types I use in my comparative research, but also I arrive at organizational variations. I talk about parties a lot, but we should not forget the radical right is bigger than the party system. It includes movements, subcultural milieus, with some connections to the parties or amongst themselves, and I come back to that later. In all of these variants, a radicalized version of the people as an ethnically or culturally homogeneous collective identity, an ethno-cultural ultranationalism, is at the center of the political programs. By definition, this means the radical exclusion of others, usually found in long-time residential national minorities in Eastern Europe, such as the Russians in the Baltic states, Hungarians in Slovakia and Romania, Turks in Bulgaria, plus the Roma, who are resident in several of these countries and get attacked frequently. And this is different from Western Europe, where immigrant groups are the central concern of the radical right when they mobilize. Now let's look at the groups in question. Here's my map of the radical right after 2000 in the region. The first observation is the ideologically more extreme parties are also electorally successful. That's on the upper left corner here in bold. These parties have reached 5% or more in several elections or even government participation. In the Western European case, you wouldn't find any of these parties being in bold, any of these types of parties. So let's talk about the ideology a little more. The East European radical right challenges both the new liberal democratic order, including the EU, and the state socialist system that preceded it. Typically, these parties, as well as the movements, philosophies are characterized by a troubled or antithetical relationship to liberal democracy. They proclaim a nostalgia for old regimes, often old despotic regimes, interwar dictatorships, and the ethnic and territorial foundation of national identity that prevailed under those regimes following the nation-building struggles before and after World War I. Many of these groups adapt symbols of the fascist movements and regimes of the 30s and 40s, such as the Hungarian Arrow Cross movement. The original posters on the upper left, and the replica of today is on the lower right. We also have the Romanian Iron Guard, which is modeled after the fascist Romanian Legion of the interwar period. There's also a fascination, as you can see here, with paramilitary outfits and symbols. They like to recycle uniforms or rediscover uniforms from the fascist part of their own countries. You see these photos of the Hungarian Guard that was banned in 2010, but resurrected in very smaller versions, still connected to Jobbik, the far-right party in Hungary. That's a new party in Slovakia, same thing. This is the photos were before they got into parliament in 2016, another fascination with paramilitary outfits in party activities. Territorial revisionism is high on the agenda of many of these parties and movements. In Romania, the Greater Romanian Party promoted interwar borders as a way of demanding the annexation of Moldova. In the meantime, the Orthodox Church in Romania has taken over some of the PRM's agenda. While the party has largely disappeared from the electoral map, movements such as Noua Dreapta, meaning new right, have continued to mobilize for the territorial revision. The map on the upper right is interwar Romania, including what was called Bessarabia, now Moldova. The desire for change is particularly intense in Hungary. The Hungarian Justice and Life Party and the Movement for a Better Hungary, or Jobbik as it's called, both attacked the Treaty of Trianon after World War I in 1919 and publicly imagined Hungary within its Habsburg-era borders. Campaign poster from Jobbik a few years ago. In Poland, the radical right has been heavily influenced by religious fundamentalism. At the beginning of the 20th century, the anti-liberal ideologue Roman Dmowski postulated that only Catholics make good Poles. He's back not only on the walls in Warsaw, but a number of parties and movements picked up on the message after 1989, most notably the League of Polish Families, LPR, now defunct. Initially, it had the support of ultra-Catholic radio station Radio Maria that regularly broadcast traditionalist but also xenophobic and sometimes even anti-Semitic speeches to millions of listeners. In the meantime, Radio Maria switched its support to the Law and Justice Party PiS, which also absorbed LPR members and voting support and bridges the mainstream right and the extreme right-wing pole of Polish politics. And if you know a bit about Polish politics, you know it's the governing party right now. In all of these countries, the Roma minority serves as a scapegoat for all kinds of social and political ills and is subject to acts of terrorism by radical right movements such as the Hungarian Guard in Hungary. The current situation is heavily influenced by the particular nation-building processes in the entire region. In contrast to those processes in Western Europe, most East European nations did not emerge in conjunctions with the bourgeois revolution or a strong liberal movement or the establishment of liberal democracy. Almost all of Eastern Europe was subject to multinational empires, like the Habsburg, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires. The dominant pattern here was the emergence of a national identity without the nation state, that is, ethno-cultural nationhood, and the establishment of a nation state along with rapid democratization after World War I, which was soon to be replaced by authoritarian dictatorships in the interwar period and by communist regimes after World War II, and they all had this in common. The region-specific legacies are relevant to the radical right today. And moreover, while in Western Europe, immigrants take the role of scapegoats that I just mentioned, these are not readily available in Eastern Europe. We have there the national minorities plus neighboring countries that take this position. As Rogers Brubaker pointed out, many post-socialist nations in the 90s could be characterized by a triadic configuration of nations between nationalizing states and their elites, the nation builders after socialism, the existence of national minorities within the new states, and the existence of external homelands. It is in this arena where ongoing effects of nation building tend to override other issues. There is no real class struggle anymore. Classless society has been reached more or less. Other issues come and go, but these issues structure political discourse for the last decades. And they help to explain the mobilization of the radical right. In today's Eastern Europe, the general levels of xenophobia and nationalism outweigh those in Western Europe. Here's an example of survey data where xenophobia is measured by the famous neighborhood question. There's no clear trend over time in all of Europe, but at both data points, with very few exceptions, more East Europeans than West Europeans did not want migrants, Muslims, or people of another race as their neighbors. This is consistent. However, this does not translate into consistent electoral mobilization, as you might expect. An overview of radical right parties' performance in national elections shows that it's higher in Western Europe and more stable in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe. There's a lot of up and down here. The only Eastern case of a radical right party mobilizing more than 10% in 2 consecutive elections is Hungarian Jobbik in 2010, 14, and again this year. there are many West European countries that regularly get 10% or more. In Austria, almost 30%. Switzerland, way above 20%. France also usually over 10% in parliamentary and even more in presidential elections. So, while in nearly all West European countries, the same parties have run in each national election since the 80s, Eastern Europe is characterized by a frequent coming and going of such parties. The average lifespan of an East European radical right party, measured by at least 1% of the vote in at least 2 consecutive national elections, is just 10 years. The only party in the entire region which consistently received more than 3% in all national elections since 1990 is the Slovak National Party, SNS, which is now in the government again for the 3rd time, but has tried to de-radicalize. Inconstancy at the polls does not translate into political irrelevancy once the radical right's interaction with its political environment is taken into account. The scenario of volatility does not apply to far-right ideology. Instead, remarkable persistence can be observed in 2 ways. First, in the absence of relevant parties, the radical right agenda is carried on by a plethora of movements and other organizations against the backdrop of the higher levels of xenophobia I just outlined. In many countries, these movements stage racist protest events, often directed at national and Roma minorities, and they impact local politics in extreme ways, as the Hungarian Guards' violent anti-Roma activities show. There have been killings in Hungary at the hands of Hungarian Guard people. An analysis of movement activities across the region that we did at my university in Frankfurt-Oder revealed an increase rather than decrease after the country's accession to the European Union. And second, religion has become a hallmark of these radical right groups that differs from their Western counterparts. While in religious terms, the Western parties are largely united by their anti-Muslim stance, and whether that's religious or not needs to be debated, the East European radical right posits a happy and quasi-natural marriage between national and Christian, usually Catholic or Orthodox identity in these countries, often helped by churches and church actors. Specifically in Poland and Romania, religious actors emerged as the torchbearers of radical right thinking. In both countries, the dominant religious tradition is closely intertwined with national identity. But there's a difference. In Poland, the radical wing of Catholicism, or national Catholicism, most notably the network led by Radio Maria, operated independently and at times in opposition to the church. In Romania, the church itself assumes a leading role in furthering key elements of the radical right agenda. For example, school curricula, nationalist school curricula are written by church officials and then inserted. In my last section, I would like to address the question of the East European radical right's impact by making the point that it has lasting effects not only on nearby competitors, that is mainstream parties, but also on the larger political system. Sorry. You can measure effects simply by government participation in coalition governments and legislation coming out of those, but also by the interaction between the radical right and the mainstream actors, even the state. We have done a study on interaction patterns in the region, and we find there's mostly a complementary interaction between radical right parties and radical right movements. So the parties do not make an effort to demarcate themselves from the movements. Sometimes parties even create the movements, like Jobbik did with the Hungarian Guard. Mainstream parties usually cooperate the radical right, in many cases invite them into government coalitions instead of demarcate themselves from them. There is no cordon sanitaire between the mainstream and the radical right except for the Czech Republic. And the state is also rather lenient. There are instruments of militant democracy available but hardly used. So this leads to my final point, impact. Against this backdrop, my research shows that the major effect of the radical right is not the implementation of a distinct set of radical right policies, but rather the radicalization of part of the mainstream, instead of mainstreaming the radical right. Most notably, PiS in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary, the two government parties that have begun the process of regime change, undoing liberal democracy from the top down, and then, of course, introducing policy shifts along the way. As we notice today, this transformation of the transformation poses severe challenges to the democratic quality and the political systems in question. I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready for some questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So we have possibility for questions for Michael Menkenberg, and again, the two microphones near the front of the hall. Just get up and attack the microphones. Okay, gentleman on my left.
So I'm very interested in that differentiation between the Western European parties that were getting over 10% in consecutive elections versus the Eastern European. What are you putting forward as some of the differentiations?
The main reason, I think, is that all these countries were led by state parties for 40 years that gave parties a very bad reputation as political actors. So if you look at survey data, you'll find trust in political parties is much lower than in Western Europe. If you look at membership, there's much less membership in these parties, in all parties, not just radical right parties. So parties have a hard standing in the East. Some parties like Fidesz actually have recovered a lot of trust for their own purposes, but in general, compared to the West, parties are not very well liked. They are a necessary evil of democracy, but people keep a distance. And then, of course, you have cases like in Hungary or in Poland where parties deconstruct themselves by scandals and very poor leadership.
Thank you for a masterly and fascinating demonstration of the differences between the former Soviet sphere states and Western Europe. What about the commonalities? Is it a totally separate phenomenon, populist nationalism in the former Soviet areas? Or does it have something in common with what's going on in countries like Germany and France and Britain?
It does, thanks. That's why I use the term radical right for both Western and Eastern versions of it, because the ultra-nationalism is the core ideology. The question is what version of ultra-nationalism then leads to a divergence of the phenomena. So, for example, you can say the Front National is ultra-nationalist as much as Jobbik is in Hungary, because they put their nation first and they have a clear vision of what it means to be French, as Jobbik has a vision what it means to be Hungarian. So there's a big commonality which then leads to issues of civil liberties in danger, of certain basic freedoms that get attacked, and also the quality of democracy may suffer despite populist promises to improve democracy. Normally that means cutting down on, for example, minority rights, which by my definition doesn't really improve democracy at all. So in that way, you have a commonality across the continent, even beyond. You could include the American far right, you could go to South Africa or Australia and include that with the same definition, but then you have to look, what are the specific criteria of exclusion and how are they applied in the political discourse and practice? And then we get into the divergence. Post-socialism, as I said, they fight the system. The West European radical right didn't have socialism to fight against. They use some of the issues we have seen in the posters with the welfare state and what we call welfare chauvinism, right? Only the nationals are entitled to share social welfare provisions. They use that selectively. They use part of the socialist rhetoric of equality or working class politics against the elites, against those who are undeserving. But using that against the undeserving is a very universal phenomenon. There was a president in this country, I think his name was Ronald Reagan, who campaigned against the undeserving poor.
We have one more question from Michael Menkenberg, and then we have reserved the last few minutes for questions for any of the panelists that any of you may have to want to ask or to compare or contrast. Yeah.
So I wanted just perhaps
Could you speak up?
a factual clarification or mode of analysis. How do you distinguish between far-right radical and right-leaning far-right? Like, let's say, AfD in Germany and the NPD, or in Hungary, Jobbik and Fidesz, I think is the, there's Viktor Orban and the party to the...
There's Fidesz and Jobbik, yeah.
What are the criteria you use to distinguish?
Hungary is messy because today we don't know anymore where the differences are between Fidesz and Jobbik. It used to be that Jobbik was much more radical in questioning the established order of things in Hungary, running against democracy as an import, a liberal imperialist import that doesn't really fit the Hungarian people. That has changed now, but Fidesz is moving more and more in that direction. But the first example is more clarifying here. AfD and NPD, for example, and you have other cases in Europe like the British National Party compared to UKIP, they attack the whole system. That's my definition of extreme right. They attack the whole system. For the NPD, despite the word democracy in the party's label, for the NPD, democracy is not really German way of doing politics. And they don't accept the post-war order either. There are still people in the NPD who want the Eastern Territories back. Right? The AfD does not want the Eastern Territories back. There are some...
Noch nicht.
What? Not yet?
Not yet.
Okay, well, if they do, I would move them. If they do, I would move them into the extremist category. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So I have to. My boss said I should sit down.
So now I welcome questions to anybody because as we think, we develop more questions. Madam.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Silla Haka, and I'm from Germany, but I live in the US, and I actually really have a question to all of you. One thread that is interesting to me from a religious or theological perspective here is that you all kind of not only talked about, let's say, disappointment or reaction, but also about visions. That visions or social imageries of change or being brought back into the center, whatever, however it is narrated, okay? And my question is, we have it in the US too, of course, it is kind of, it seems to be forward, going, make America great again, then you scratch the surface and it is very reactionary, yeah? But my question concerns the role of religion and the churches. In Western Europe, because I'm from Germany, I know that the very, very moderate, if not in the question of the refugees, progressive Christian churches, both the Protestant and the Catholics, they were attacked not only by the right-wingers, but also by intellectuals who said, we do not, you play with fire if you exercise too much solidarity, we need some kind of national identity. My question is, do you see that the churches in the different countries more or less only have a kind of a reactionary vision? Or is there, let's say, I use it not in a political way, progressive vision that religion and the churches also kind of operate on? And do they get across at all? Or is kind of the operation that Steve Bannon does with the Vatican and with the different churches, is that the successful model right now for religions, especially in Europe, but maybe also in South Africa?
I would start answering that as far as Germany is concerned, with you, which you, Mrs. Harker, know fairly well, I guess. There is, of course, a vision which, in the Protestant case, very strongly connects to ecumenism, and that is not only on the functional the functionary level, where some functionaries meet at the World Council of Churches, but this is really on a grassroots level. About 1/5 of all parishes, Protestant parishes in Germany, have ecumenical context partnerships with parishes overseas, abroad, and that sort of heightens understanding by travels going forth, and I think this is an important aspect. Also, as a lesson, as a historical lesson learned, the idea of an internationalism, which does not, which doesn't necessarily impede patriotism. The notion of internationalism is quite strong in Roman Catholic churches for other reasons than in Protestant churches, but it still is. And for that reason, I think there is a pretty strong, even among the elites, still a pretty strong strain, for instance, for the European Union, even though the shortcomings are clearly seen. And for that reason, I think there is still such a vision. I'm not so, I really don't know enough about, for instance, the different Dutch denominations.
I think he has.
Okay, about the vision thing, as George Bush, the father, used to say, you have to remember, not only in Germany, but in most of Europe, there was a very strong reluctance to buy into visions after World War II. So when you look at the process of European unification or rebuilding of democracy, they were not looking for visions, they were not debating different versions of visions, they were just trying to get things back to normal and build up the democratic and organization, economic orders. The thing is that today, there's a lack of that in the way that the radical right, for example, offers big visions, and quite a lot of people go for that. They want big ideas and not just technocratic solutions. You know, there's a German chancellor, Helmut Schmidt, the second to last social democratic chancellor, who once said, if you have visions, go see a doctor. And of course, he was accused of having no visions for his own party and for Germany as a whole. So this is the attitude of most of the elites.
Although, I'm just going to throw in a line and then Dion can, I think looking towards a future of non-apocalyptic and non-militarily explosive Europe is itself a vision, which I think much of Europe had after the Second World War, and had Europe as a cooperative landscape as a vision.
Sorry that I'm budging in, but I also think Europe was a vision. A united Europe was a vision after World War II. Besides the human rights movement, that was one of the strongest visions there was. Even though your skepticism is right too, but that was a vision.
It was more elite vision than people's vision. If you look at mass...
You use the microphone.
Oh, sorry, this was more an elite vision than a mass vision. If you look at the major mobilization phases, was against disarmament and against armament in Germany and social issues. They brought millions of people to the street. Europe never brought millions of people to the streets.
Dion, do you want to weigh in on the church question? Then we have another question from this woman on our left, my left.
The only thing that, I mean, what's been said already, I concur with, and it's constructed slightly differently in a context like South Africa that is so deeply and overtly religious. And the role of the religious and the political is often very difficult to separate. And aspects of that are progressive or constructive. That's very difficult. The only question that I would ask is when, particularly for us as theologians, when we speak of the church, what are we talking about? Because we often find that ecumenical bodies or leadership bodies are far more progressive or constructive than the members of local communities.
Madam.
Thanks. My question has been addressed partially already. It has something to do with this idea of visions. We've heard about how nationalism is not necessarily the same, but overlaps in some cases with populism, with troubling results. But we've also seen that the idea of aligning the identity of a people with a nation state is one way of imagining the way we might organize our common life together. And as I believe we're looking at it for the most part as outsiders of this phenomenon, I would wonder on from what ground might we say we are looking at this other phenomenon. That is to say, what in a world that is rapidly globalizing, what are the alternative visions for organizing common life together? Is there sort of an unspoken assumption about what it should be? And is that a liberal individualism? Is it a globalism? Or is it, like you have just mentioned, perhaps just a basic peacekeeping technocracy? What is going unstated here?
I'm going to start, and then I'm sure other people have much to weigh in. I think it's a wonderful question, thank you for that. I'd like to throw out the idea of subsidiarity, which is the idea of overlapping cooperative areas of governance. You asked about, we have a globalizing world, we have the nation state, which has strengths and weaknesses, we have radical neoliberal individualism. What are the possibilities for envisioning a future? And so the idea of subsidiarity allows for larger and then smaller and smaller units of governance to work cooperatively depending on the task at hand. So you can think of environment, healthcare, education, etc. Some might be better adjudicated, discussed, not top-down, but discussed, negotiated, developed more locally at smaller units, and some more on larger units with also negotiation and discussion and cooperation through the levels of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is originally a Catholic term, but it has been picked up and discussed recently for governance issues as a vision to address exactly what you asked about the fear of some kind of global world order on one hand and radical neo-individualism on the other, but rather an overlapping series of governance bodies that negotiate with that are their constituencies and also discuss and negotiate among themselves. So that's one vision.
And just to exemplify, the idea was became concrete in, for instance, the idea of the Europe of regions, where you had regions with pretty large autonomy, then you had the nation state, then you had the European Union, and different governance levels. And that, I mean, the idea has been botched up, obviously, but it could have worked. And it worked for a long time. For instance, in Spain with the Catalans, it worked for a long time pretty well. So you could have like levels of governance and levels of belonging, which worked better than than an imperial policy or a too strict nation state. On a religious level, let me quote a study that I've been receiving, where they asked young people of Turkish origin in the second or third generation in Germany, who have identity problems for the reason that in Germany they're still seen as immigrants,
even though they're fluent in German, there's this third generation. But in Turkey, they're seen as the Germans, even though they know Turkish and so on, because they are seen as not anybody anymore. So what do they see themselves as? And they have discovered religion as a point of identity. They say, we're Muslims. We're Turkish German Muslims. And when this goes well, and in that case it did go well, it didn't bound out into extremism. It was just one version of an identity construction that says, well, we're German citizens but our identity, one of our strong identity aspects is being Muslim, and that solved a problem for those people.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, because I still believe that it's very hard to have a grand counter-narrative that has the reach and the imagination comparable to that from the radical right. The first thing I think would be to show everyone that their solutions are not solutions to the problems that they want to fix. Rather than having a big counter-narrative, is to expose them and show that they are not really helpful, they are not productive, they are counterproductive. That's the first thing. The second, the regionalism, I'm skeptical that would be a solution. I don't want to see, for example, Saxony as an autonomous region, politically speaking. Same, you could have Bavarian nationalism, or you have Scottish nationalism. You could have a far-right party in Catalonia that's much more effective on the regional level than it is on the national level. So in that way, regionalism may actually move the problem from the national to the regional level. Do you have to find political structures that make it harder for them in terms of who qualifies as a party or who gets access to what resources, rather than simply saying, well, you have to be closer to the people. If you do then grassroots democracy, in particular communes in Saxony, that's the end of democracy.
Okay. Just for the record, subsidiarity is not the same as regionalism. It's a much more complex idea. I'm afraid we hit 3 minutes after 3, and I'm afraid people have to get to other places. So I'd like to once again thank our panelists, and thank you all for listening and for joining us today.